Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. In South Africa, a highly esteemed guest of venerable stature is not introduced by any ordinary person. They are introduced by what we call an imbongi. An imbongi, loosely translated into the English language, is a praise poet of significant stature in society. In our oral tradition, the imbongi is the voice of the people. He is deeply rooted in the consciousness of the people and acts as an intermediary between the past, the present, and the future. The imbongi looks to the past and summons the great deeds of the men and women who came before, thereby situating the honoree temporarily as part of the historical continuum in that evolution of society. But the imbongi also bears a very heavy duty, and that is the duty of speaking to the future, to posterity. I am by no means an imbongi, but I will humbly ask this privilege today, Justice Ntsebeza, that I may appropriate, if only temporarily, the honor of introducing you on behalf of our people of South Africa and the peoples of the entire continent of South Africa in the most deserving of ways of a visitor of your stature. In that respect, I will accept the honor which I have imposed upon myself. It seems almost predestined that your name Dumisa in isiXhosa would mean praise, because there is an abundance of praise and accolades attached to your name that go beyond the few minutes I have available to me of introducing you. Where does one begin? Valiant political activist, renowned academic, legal practitioner of unassailable integrity, and the most venerable jurist. To the peoples of Africa, you are known affectionately as the people's advocate. It is no surprise that from your ancestral soil of Kala, on the banks of the Tsomo River, sprung giants in our liberation movement. For we all know the legends of the great amaXhosa philosopher warrior kings. I am speaking here of Hintsa, of Makanda, of Ncika. These great philosopher kings of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries who waged the first wars against colonialism. They were the first prisoners in our war for liberation. And in the 20th century, continuing this history, yourselves and young people, Justice Ntsebeza, were engaged in the liberation struggle. In 1976, the dreadful year in which the apartheid government showed its aggression by killing high school children, it is that year in which you were imprisoned and spent the next 5.5 years of your youthful life in prison. But it was not out of idleness, but in the confines of this jail cell, it is there where you acquired your law degree. Between 1985 and 1993, on your release, you were involved in establishing and becoming the chairperson of the Prisoners' Welfare Program that agitated for the release of political prisoners and the grant of injunctions against those who were arbitrarily detained. We acknowledge our indebtedness for the benefit we have derived for your life in dedication of our freedom. You have joined the ranks of revolutionary South African lawyers of the 21st century, of the 20th century. I am talking here of none other than Pixika Isakaseme, Oliver Tambo, Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, Mlungisi Mxenge, Nonyamezelo Mxenge, and Dumasile Nokwe, to name a few. Growing up during apartheid South Africa myself, and living through its transitions, we would be told about the legendary, triumphant tales of these extraordinary, almost mythical legends of Africa. In dedicating their lives for the rights of the freedoms of the people who were denied their humanity, they ungated the law, they entered it, they occupied it, they restructured it, and they corrected it, all the while refusing to be defined by laws that refuse to recognize their own humanity. It is you, Justice Ntsebeza, who became the first African senior counsel at the Cape Bar. In so doing, you ennobled the law. You made it universal, and you gave it a future voice for generations of lawyers such as myself. Your heroism is indeed a reminder that the world need not be taken nor left as it was found. You have worked with 3 Nobel Peace Prize recipients: our beloved Mandela, our beloved Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the diplomatic giant that is Kofi Annan. During the fragile transitionary period, when South Africans chose peace over civil war, an exemplary human achievement to the rest of the world, to this very day, you were entrusted with the delicate task of peace and reconciliation on behalf of our people. In 1996, you were appointed by Nelson Mandela to head the TRC's investigative unit. And in that role, Justice Ntsebeza, you poured over hundreds and thousands of tearful testimonies of our people. You went into those places where you exhumed the bones of those who were taken in the dead of night and in broad daylight and were disappeared and killed. You uncovered untruths. And in so doing, you went into that forbidden territory of the human heart where evil resides. And you sought to unlock its truths in the hope that in so doing, the oppressor may, through his own truth-telling, liberate himself. Our beloved Madiba reminds us in his Long Walk to Freedom biography that a man who takes another man's freedom is a prisoner of hate. Surely the oppressor must also be liberated the same way as the oppressed. Madiba reflects and says, I look back on my long journey, and I look back on the distance, and I realize that we are not yet free. What we have merely gained is the freedom to be free. And that my long journey to freedom has not yet come to an end, and I dare not linger. You, Justice Ntsebeza, have not lingered in the post-apartheid era of South Africa. From 2001 to 2013, you were bold enough to act as lead counsel in Ntsebeza versus Citibank, when you took American corporations to court for allegedly aiding and abetting the apartheid regime under the Alien Tort Statute. In 2005, at the request of Secretary General Kofi Annan, you were the Commissioner of the United Nations International Commission on the Inquiry on Darfur. You have served on the South African judiciary. You have also served on the South African Judicial Services Commission, which is a constitutional body charged with appointing judges. In February 2021, you were voted by members of the All Council onto the African Court for Human and People's Rights. An illustrious academic, from being a high school teacher to a university professor and chancellor of the University of Fort Hare, the only university in Africa that has produced the largest number of heads of states in the world. To being a distinguished visiting professor of political science and law at the University of Connecticut. Heavy is the burden on history's witness, for he must bear testimony for all of posterity. The scripture tells us that write down all that you see of present happenings and of things that will still come. In an age of contested narratives over truth, reconciliation, and justice, your writings remind us that when we think back, we, the peoples of the future, when we evaluate history, we should think of the time and the events in which those events occurred. That hindsight is the most exact and precise of sciences. That our project of truth and reconciliation remains an unfinished project. And Justice Ntsebeza, as I'm about to conclude, I would be remiss, of course, if I do not quote Karl Marx, your big political influence. There's a funny story, ladies and gentlemen, which I'll quickly tell, where Justice Ntsebeza, in his appointment panel to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there sat a priest. And the priest questioned him, and Justice Ntsebeza said, well, I'm a Marxist. And your God tells us that we'll achieve equality and justice in the next life. Marx tells me that we will achieve it in this life. In his 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, published in 1852, Karl Marx tells us that men and women make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And we, just as we are preoccupied with revolutionizing ourselves and our society and creating things that did not exist before, it is precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis that we conjure up the spirits of the past to our service. Justice Ntsebeza, your scholarly work tells us, the people of the future, to think when we act. Your work reminds me of the great German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht, who writes in his famous poem To Posterity, that you who shall emerge from the flood in which we are sinking, think when you speak of our weaknesses and of the dark times that brought them forth. For when it shall come to pass that man shall help his fellow man, do not judge us too harshly. Out of the most violent of political regimes that the world has ever seen, emerged a most venerable constitution and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has captured the imagination of the entire world. On April 28, 2021, my alma mater, Rhodes University, conferred the honorary degree of Laws Honoris Causa on you, Justice Ntsebeza. And the Vice-Chancellor said in his address, we owe an inestimable debt of gratitude and appreciation to you, who has dedicated his entire life for the liberation of our country and all that which is good. That said, ladies and gentlemen, I must welcome Justice Ntsebeza in his mother tongue, isiXhosa, and say, wamkelekile tata, ekhaya lethu. Welcome to Notre Dame.
Oh, good afternoon. I thought there were people here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. I can't resist telling a short story before I read what I am going to say to you about my journey from a messenger to a justice of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. The Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the late, may his soul rest in peace, used to tell a story of a widow who took her daughter to a funeral of her husband. And as accolade upon accolade was heaped on the deceased by speaker after speaker, the Archbishop tells us that the widow said to her daughter, I think we have come to a wrong funeral. So I hope that after all those accolades that have been heaped upon me. There isn't anyone here who's going to say, hey, man, it cannot be about Ntsebeza. That's that Tradi is talking about. You now know that my name is Dumisa Ntsebeza. Buhle means, and I think my parents here were quite ambitious, means handsome. I was born a little more than 70 years ago in a small town in the Transkei, in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, in a place called Cala, C-A-L-A. Both my mother and father were school teachers. My father having been the principal of many secondary schools, most of which he founded as principal, and ironically, one of them being the Dutch Reformed Church School, the Kala DRC Mission Secondary School, the Nederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk in Afrikaans, which later became known as the Athatsingiwe Training or Secondary School. He was principal of that school from roughly 1947 to 1955, and he only left the school because it was going to be a teacher training school. And in terms of the then Bantu Education Act, number 47 of 1953, all training schools were supposed to have white people as their principals. It was suggested to him that he could become a deputy. He refused to be a deputy in a school which he had founded as principal for almost a decade. I got my secondary education up to junior certificate, standard 8, at the Athatsingiwe Training School, and because I wanted to go to university and I had to have a matric from that, I applied to St. John's College in Mthatha, a place in the Eastern Cape, for matric for the years 1965 to 1966. Because I was going to boarding school for the first time, and I needed some pocket money, since my father, from the end of 1964-1966, was engaged in a contested lawsuit with the Department of Bantu Education and have been suspended and was barely earning anything, I went to Cape Town for the first time in 1964 to be with an uncle who was the husband of my mother's sister. From October 1964 to January 1965, I did odd jobs under the watchful eye of that uncle of mine. In order to continue work in the city of Cape Town and escape being endorsed out of the city of Cape Town, in terms of Section 10 of the Urban Areas Act number 41 of 1950, also known as the Urban Areas Act or the Group Areas Act, my uncle had to hold a job to be in the peninsula of Cape Town. And therefore, because he had to hold a job, he held this kind of a job as a driver of a white taxi owner who owned a fleet of metered taxis and who operated these taxis from an address in C Street in Cape Town. The owner of this fleet of taxis was Mr. Todd. My uncle, and therefore I, when I joined him from university, would be at Mr. Todd's residence in the morning, take his children to school, and after having dropped them off, would then go back to C Street and get into overalls and do all the repair and mechanical work that needed to be done to any one of the fleet of taxis that needed attention. At about 1,300 hours every working day, we would then fetch the children, our bus's children, bus meaning the boss, the employer, the employer's children from school, and drop them off at Mr. Todd's home. And then thereafter, the day was done for us. And that was sufficient to earn my uncle his entitlement to remain in the peninsula area of the Cape, because he had a job. Otherwise, he would have been endorsed out of that area within 72 hours if he did not have a job. Such was the life of black people in South Africa of that age. Mr. Mabona's main livelihood, however, came from a driving school that he ran at Zone 19, Langa Township. Typically, our day, after having dropped off Mr. Todd's children, which would be occupied by my uncle teaching mostly illiterate aspirant heavy-duty drivers and preparing them for learner's licenses and thereafter driver's licenses, that would be the average day for him. For this occupation, he had bought a 1948 Chevrolet truck, which he used for that purpose. The training at his driving school, which was called Funda Boys Special. Funda means learn, so Funda Boys, learning boys special. Elderly people in South Africa were usually called boys. I think that was also the culture during segregation in this country. Used to be in the afternoon, so our day used to be taking Funda Boys Special and would go in the afternoon from about 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. with my uncle teaching these people who needed heavy-duty licenses for them to be able to be employed in the Western Cape. Thereafter, my uncle would occupy himself by either sewing garments that had been placed on order from him by people who knew his skill in that regard, or by distributing those garments that he had finished sewing, going from door to door, collecting outstanding monies for garments that had already been delivered. My uncle's stay in Cape Town was short-lived, as after 1964, he became one of the first recipients of a Transkei program of empowerment, in terms whereof certain designated shops were given to aspirant shopkeepers in the rural areas of Transkei, under the dispensation run by an organization called the Xhosa Development Corporation. He got that shop in 1966 at a place called Ngumakala in the Ngcoga district of Tofimbaba in the Transkei. Whilst he was living in Cape Town, one of the occupants of a 4-roomed residence which he shared with another family, was his wife's sister, Lulama Princess Ndondo, the mother of Batandwa Ndondo. Let me just digress for a moment, and those who were in my class just now, before we came here, I told them about the story of Batandwa Ndondo. Batandwa Ndondo was murdered in Kala, my hometown, by Eugene de Kock's Flat Plus operatives, a death squad that was legalized by the apartheid order, a death squad that had the power of life and death over anyone whom they suspected to be a terrorist. They had picked Batandwa Ndondo, and within 30 minutes after they had picked him from my home, he was shot 9 times. 8 of those bullets, whilst he was in a supine position, according to a pathologist who examined his dead body. For those who have access to a book called The Unfinished Business, Apartheid, South Africa and Truth, you will find this account fully given by me and Terry Bell, who is the co-author of that book with me. And it is under the title, The Killing of Batandwa Ndondo. But then that's a digression. I was explaining that my aunt, a sister to my uncle's husband, Mr. Mabona, was the mother of Batandwa Ndondo. Before Mabona left Cape Town, and in order to secure the residence at NY1, NY used to stand for Native Yard, and it was the demarcation of an area about, well, it was never large, it's about 9 by 9 yards square. That was the piece of land that Mabona had secured as a residence in Cape Town. Lulama Princess Ndondo was the resident who was going to take over from Mabona, who, as I indicated earlier on, had received this opportunity to go and run a business in the Eastern Cape, in Transkei, as one of the first entrepreneurs which were given the right to own shops under a dispensation of these so-called homelands. The husband to my aunt Lulama Ndondo was a messenger at Utilitas Building, 1 Dorp Street, Cape Town. And that is a building that housed, at that time, the advocates of the Cape Bar. Now in South Africa, when you talk about advocates, you mean barristers, not just people who are doing a course. It's a word that is used to describe those who, at some stage, were the only lawyers who had a right of appearance in the superior courts of the country. As I understand, the position here is that attorneys, you are just an attorney and you can appear in any court, right up to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. You know, with the passage of time, things have come pretty much to being similar in South Africa, because now, subject to a few years in practice, everyone who is legally qualified has now the right to appear up to the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in the land. At that time, only advocates. And therefore, in the course of us looking and chasing the story of Dennis, we should know that when I talk about advocates, I mean lawyers who had the right of appearance in the high courts of the land. I just said, therefore, that my uncle, Mr. Sidumo, Alfred Sidumo, was a messenger for advocates at the Cape Bar. Now, this building was convenient for its proximity to the Cape High Court, and Mr. Sidumo was a messenger for advocates occupying the 9th and the 10th floors of that building. And the story of Dennis must be understood within that historical matrix. In 1967, and pretty much for the same reasons that I had come to Cape Town for the first time in 1964, I came to Cape Town from October of that year, and I was to remain in Cape Town until the end of January 1968. This arrangement had been that during the plowing season, my uncle, the husband of Lulama Princess Ndondo, Mr. Sidumo, would go to his ancestral home in the Transkei called Willowvale and would be involved in plowing. He would obviously take a long leave, to which he would ordinarily not have been entitled because of the laws at that time. The laws at that time were that you were not to absent yourself away from the urban areas for more than 72 hours at a time. The arrangement, therefore, was that he would leave me to substitute for him as a messenger for the advocates on the 9th and 10th floor of Utilitas building. And his return to work would coincide with the time that I had to return to where I came from. This dovetailed with my own program. I was a final year BA student in the I was a first year BA student in the University of Fort Hare in 1967. Our examinations were over by the end of October, and I could come to Cape Town and earn pocket money before proceeding back to university in the following year. Where I assumed duties, my uncle was there during October, November to orientate me in how his job could best be performed. From what I can recall, there were two of them who worked Certainly, the two of them worked certainly for the 9th floor. The person who was employed at the switchboard as an operator was an African male, originally from Fort Beaufort, which is an area also in the Eastern Cape. His name was Johnson. I've not forgotten what his surname was. The floor manager on that floor, on the 9th floor, was Advocate John Foxcroft, as he then was. Please remember this name because it features prominently towards the end of my journey as Mr. Dennis. I noticed that Johnson was one of those officious Africans in what was arguably a privileged job. To operate the switchboard and to field some calls was a prestigious job. And he regarded himself as hierarchically superior to my uncle, Mr. Alfred Sidumu, who principally was the messenger of the group. Typically, Johnson would come and get onto the switchboard, put on his earphones, sitting in front of this board that had holes into which you would stick the metal end of a telephone wire, which would then trigger a ring in the chamber of the advocate who was being phoned. He had even mastered the art of responding to an incoming call. I remember that he would typically say, Advocate Gerald Gordon's chambers, good morning. Advocate John Foxcross chambers, good afternoon, and so on. Because Johnson at some stage had to take lunch, he had the duty to orientate my uncle, and therefore me, in this treasured skill of being able to manipulate the telephone keyboard. Typically, therefore, my uncle and therefore I, when he was out for lunch, would also sit at the switchboard and mutter in as cultivated a tone as Johnson had mastered the incantation. Advocate Bamford's chambers, good afternoon. Advocate Cambridge's chambers, good afternoon. Otherwise, my uncle's job, and therefore mine, for the full time that he was away in the rural areas, was to go out at 10 o'clock in the morning with briefs that were being delivered to the attorneys who had briefed the requisite advocates at this bar, and or collect briefs from the various firms of attorneys that were briefing counsel. It was also to do the odd jobs of doing banking for the various advocates. That 10 o'clock round would typically end with me returning from having walked the streets of Cape Town, sometimes right down to the offices at the Fosu near the docks in Cape Town, and walking my way back to chambers, getting back there at about 11:30 or 12, in time for me to be available to do tea for the advocates on request. Typically, when counsel had visitors or when counsel was consulting with his attorneys and his clients, they would make the order from me or Johnson. Because Johnson was otherwise occupied at the switchboard, the task would then fall on me. 2 teas, Dennis. 1 tea, Dennis. That was the standard kind of order, for example. Whenever I arrived and my uncle indicated that I would substitute him whilst he went home for the plowing season, and because it was critically important that in terms of the law then, in order for him not to lose his job, a fiction had to be created that he had been in continuous employment without interruption for a period of not less than 10 years if he was to avoid being endorsed out of the peninsula in terms of Section 10 of the Urban Areas Act, which I indicated earlier on in my speech. This arrangement had to be transparent, and his employers had to know that he would return, but that in his absence, because I was substituting for him for the purpose already stated, his job was secure, because he would have been in gainful, uninterrupted employment in the peninsula of Cape Town throughout the period of his being in Cape Town. My details had to be established. I had to produce my reference book, charmingly called the Dom Pass. Dom means stupid. So it was the pass for the stupid, or in the township it was called the stinker, which was a way in which the Africans reacted to the oppression that came with this identity book called the Donbass. Where these words originated from and why they were used is yet another story for another day. My Donbass had to be inspected to establish whether I was lawfully in the city of Cape Town. My Donbass had been endorsed both in Kala, where I came from, and in Langa Township, where the influx control offices were. The endorsements in my Donbass would show that I am permitted to be in the metropolitan area of the Cape Peninsula for longer than 72 hours. Johnson, I remember, had demanded my reference book, which I had given to him. Between Johnson and Advocate John Foxcroft, as he then was, the floor leader on the 9th floor, despite the fact that my Donbass clearly showed that my name was Dumisa Ntsebeza, I got told by Johnson, if I now recall, that I would be called Dennis. Though they saw that there was no Dennis in my identity book. I have to admit that at that stage, my attitude, I think, was that if they wanted to call me Dennis, it was up to them. I do believe that I also wanted the job. And I was not going to make a fuss about what the white people decided to call me. So between Johnson, the officious employee, and Advocate John Foxcroft, the floor manager, notwithstanding what was in my Donbass, I became Dennis. And that's who I was called by every advocate for whom I did deliveries and made tea. I recall that on the 9th floor, there were advocates Comrie, Koi, Bamford, Gerald Gordon, QC, Queen's Counsel. And that on the 10th floor, there was the colorful advocate Snitcher, SC, and Advocate Irons SC, who I now believe practices in the United Kingdom. During my lunch breaks, which would typically be between 1400 hours and 1500 hours, when Johnson was back from lunch, which he used to take between 1300 hours and 1400 hours, and before I would then go out for my afternoon rounds as a messenger, which would start at about 1500 hours, which entails the same routine, taking briefs to and from the attorneys and related errands. During my lunch breaks, I mainly occupied myself with reading newspapers. But I got fascinated with a book that had just been published entitled For People, which I then gathered had been written by Advocate Gerald Gordon SC. I read the book very avidly. During January of 1968, and after I had read the book, which principally, as I remember, told the story of two families, one black and one white, and how they were affected differently by the vagaries of the apartheid laws. A heart-rending reflection of how, for instance, in the one white family, the family was torn tragically because one of the sons born to that white family was a shade darker than his other siblings. Such was apartheid, that as he grew older and therefore darker, the one brother was forced to go to colored schools, while his other sibling was privileged to go to white schools. All the consequences of apartheid in terms of residences, schools, amenities, classification, visited the other brother. The African family was a typical Langa Township family which could not live as a family because of the influx laws of that time. For People was about those kinds of stories, richly woven in the prose of which Gerald Gordon QC was a master. His literal skills were only matched by his prowess in the courtroom. This advocate was also an author of authoritative textbooks in the area of insurance law. I had done this kind of research on him whilst I was reading his book. And even though I was quite content to be just a Dennis as far as everybody else was concerned, I could not resist one day, in the course of my delivering briefs into his chambers, asking him in the following manner, if I still remember. Excuse me, sir. Am I right that you are the same Gerald Gordon QC that has written the book For People, which I have just finished reading? And what a fascinating story. I think the question was unexpected and came as a great shock to Advocate Gerald Gordon QC. He was sitting at his table and must have been doing some work, because as soon as I asked the question, he sat back in his chair and asked me, "What did you say?" For a moment, I hesitated whether I should again ask the question. I gathered strength and, putting on the broadest smile I could on my face, repeated the question. I felt that I should go further and say to him, as a matter of fact, I seem to recall or recollect that there is another book which you probably have written, with which I was impressed. I told him, smiling foolishly and broadly, that the other book was entitled Let the Day Perish. I was saying all this quickly, and that is when he began to take off his spectacles and looking at me very closely, and then asking, "Dennis, who are you?" I then told him that I had read his book, Let the Day Perish, at the Fort Hare University Library, where I was a BA student. That indeed my mother had just written to me and that I was happy to share the letter with him, in which my mother told me that my university examination results had come and that I had passed all the 5 courses for which I had registered, and the symbols ranged from A for African languages to C for history, history of philosophy, English and Latin 1. From that day on, Advocate Gerald Gordon QC exchanged more than just instructions to me whenever I went to his chambers. It was a relationship that culminated in him inviting me and a friend of mine, Mr. Dumisa from Fort Hare University, who had also been visiting Cape Town from Queenstown. His home was positioned on the shores of Clifton Beach in such a way that you had a clear view of Robben Island. Gordon QC remarked to us that it was from looking at Robben Island from where his home was and the people it kept as prisoners. And you know from what you must have read from history that some of the prisoners who were in Robben Island were your Nelson Mandela, your Walter Sisulu, and others who were involved in the Rivonia trial. Gordon QC told me that it was from looking at Robben Island and the people it kept as prisoners that the idea to write for people was born. At a lunch that he organized for me and my friend, Mr. Ntsebeza, we were joined by Mrs. Gordon, who was a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. There then was an animated debate that was sparked by a question from Mrs. Gordon as to how we reacted to the 7 Days War, which had been fought between Israel and Egypt the previous year, 1967. Mbulelo and I had supported Abdul Nasser, the Egyptian president, and Mrs. Gordon, being Jewish, had obviously supported the Israelis. Hence, the very animated discussion during lunch at her home. It was a very good debate. Gerald Gordon QC must have sat there and wondered whether I was not actually a Mossad secret agent acting as an agent provocateur. Now, if I fast forward and skip the events that befell me in 1968, including my expulsion from the University of Fort Hare, my arrest and detention in terms of Section 6 of the Terrorism Act in 1968, as you heard Professor Chadi saying in his introduction. My conviction thereafter, my life subsequently as a school teacher, as a bank teller, and my rearrest in 1976 and conviction and sentence by Mr. Justice G.G.A. Munich, my study for a law degree in prison, and my qualifying and admission as an attorney in 1984, where I met Christine Fender. I hear you call her Vender. Almost 30 years after 1967, when I was a messenger in Cape Town, you must now picture a situation where, as a member of the Cape Law Society Council, I am sitting next to who had now become Judge John Foxcroft at a dinner organized by the Cape Law Society almost every year on the 31st of March, to which judges in the Cape bench would be invited. Picture now, please picture now, me being a member of the Cape Law Society Council and a member of its disciplinary committee. Picture in that scenario, me raising the question of whether Judge Foxcroft remembers a time 30 years ago at that date when he was floor manager on the 9th floor in 1 Dorp Street Utilitas building, Cape Town. Picture him being excited when I recite the number of people who were on that floor. And then picture him turning around to me and saying, "How do you know all these people? How do you know all of this in such a stark detail?" Or words to that effect. I then tell him the story that I have just told you. He obviously is crestfallen and quite surprised and asked the question, "But why did you call yourself Dennis? Because your name Dumisa is quite an easy name to call." I resisted with difficulty, having to say to him, "You are able to say Dumisa now in 1997, because it is 1997. It was 1967 then. And it was far convenient to give me a Christian name than to be content with what was not a Christian name, Dumisa." As I have said, it could easily have been the officiousness of Johnson, who could have told them that the name I should be called by is Dennis, because he was that kind of a person, Johnson. However, to the extent that the judge, who then was a floor manager, had to deal with verifying who I was by looking at my dompas, he clearly would have noticed that I was not Dennis. I never made an issue then. I did not make an issue about it at that dinner. I am merely stating facts and speculating about why those facts panned out the way they did. In 1999, on the 1st of February, I had the privilege of sitting in the Cape High Court on my first day as a Cape High Court acting judge in an appeal from a judgment that had been handed down by one of the judges. I had read the papers during the December recess, and was finalizing 3 outstanding investigations in the TRC from October 1998 to January 1999. During the conference of the judges who were sitting on appeal, and there were 3 of us, after we had heard the appeal, I clearly saw the matter differently to 2 of my senior colleagues. One of the judges I sat with was Judge Comrie. You will remember Comrie was one of the advocates on the 9th floor. The other judge was Judge Andre Bigno. I clearly differed with the 2 of them. We had reserved judgment At the end of my term, I indicated that if they still held to the views that they had at our conference, I would have to write a dissenting judgment. However, I was gratified to write. However, I was gratified to learn that one of the judges had since written a separate judgment differing from his colleague. That was Judge Comrie. In order to save me the burden of having to write my own judgment, which would have been a dissenting judgment, Judge Comrie had written a judgment in line with the position that I had taken when we had a conference. Judge Bino's judgment became the dissenting judgment in the circumstances. Some of the South African law reports for the years 1999, 2000, and 2001 will show that I sat with Judge John Foxcroft in some of the criminal appeals that we dealt with. I had one of the most pleasurable moments sitting in that Cape bench and sharing with those judges for whom I had been a messenger and a tea maker. Life for me had turned full circle. If I then fast forward to when I became a group leader of advocates in 2010 in Cape Town, I look back to that day in 1967 when I joined the advocates on the 9th and 10th floors as a messenger. But more particularly, I look back to that day when Advocate Gerald Gordon QC asked me, "Dennis, who are you?" During the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in either 1996 or 1997, a former Cape Judge President Gerald Friedman's son, Roger, then a journalist within the Cape Times, a newspaper in the Western Cape, wrote about the Dennis story and actually brought me and the aging Gerald Gordon QC together. The story was complemented by a photograph that he took of the two of us. I being a commissioner in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the late Gerald Gordon QC being an interested person in the workings and the goings on of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He would have been, because he is the man who, as an advocate, had represented Fikile Bam, who had served 10 years in Robben Island, despite his good representation, but had become the president of the Land Claims Court in the democracy after 1994. Gerald Gordon had also represented his colleagues, including Dr. Neville Alexander the late, when they were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years on Robben Island in the 60s. It is a small world, and Dennis has been a part of it in many ways. It is even smaller because Dennis is here today. 2 years ago, I was minding my own business, as I always do, when I was approached by the South African Minister of Justice and asked whether I would accept a nomination from NGOs in South Africa to become a judge in the African Court on Human and People's Rights. I told the minister that I doubted if I qualified, because in my country at the moment, I am not a sitting judge. I'm a barrister. The good minister retorted, haven't you been a judge? I've read some of your judgments in the labor journals. I've read some of your judgments in the South African Law Report. Please, I want you to be nominated. And then I said, well, he said, African what? African Court on Human and People's Rights. And then I said, well, let's see what will happen if my name is forwarded. Because like Mandela is known to have said, I also was asking myself whether I'm the right person to be considered for nomination. You will all know that one. When Mandela said, and I want to emulate him, I am not a saint unless you think of a saint as one who keeps on trying. I'm trying. Thank you.
Do not go away, though. Our work is not yet done. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have about 10 minutes for questions. I would ask that you please keep your questions very brief because of time. We will take one question at a time and then get an answer and then move on to the next question. So I will be the question marshal, in essence. There is a question up there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, in your work during the African Court of Human Rights, have you noticed the impact of transitional justice processes in the societies, in the realization of human rights? And if you could tell me your opinion about it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
I haven't heard what the question is.
I'm sorry. I was wondering your opinion, like if you, during your work in the African Court of Human Rights, have analyzed or seen the impact of transitional justice processes in societies, like in the cases you have received in the African Court of Human Rights. and how does that impact, how is, for example, the situation of some vulnerable groups?
Yes. Well, by transitional justice, I suppose if we just summarized what it means, the kind of justice that looks at all options, including options that do not necessarily call for criminal prosecution, a process that looks at alternatives, like, for instance, truth and reconciliation commissions. However, the court has been established to deal with crimes which are reflected both in the Charter as violations of principles which are, in the Charter, and it operates in terms of the protocol. So there is very little room for us to veer away from the provisions of the Charter. But I don't think there is any objection to some of us who may be adventurous and seek to infuse in the jurisprudence of the court notions that are raised by the debate in transitional justice. I can see a situation where, for instance, there are ways or there are respects, like when the situation in Sierra Leone was dealt with, where on the one hand, there would be a recommendation for the most serious crimes being dealt with in terms of the criminal justice system, but on the other hand, for other offenses being dealt with in terms of seeking reconciliation between the perpetrators and the victims.
The next question comes from Professor Dan Biscuit.
Justice Dumisa, thank you so much for this lecture. I'm a deep admirer of the work of the African Court, but most especially the judgment that came out last year, the reparations judgment of the court in African Commission versus Kenya, where for the first time, a regional human rights court ordered the return of indigenous peoples' ancestral land in the Mao Forest with respect to the Ogiek people. That seems to me to forebode a very clear adventurism, which has never happened before in human rights jurisprudence, ordering the wholesale return of land and ordering the government of Kenya to ensure the preservation and protection of that land. My question at this point is the court in a trajectory now, notwithstanding the reticence of other African states to join the court, is the court more willing at this point to proceed with this kind of imaginative reparations that does call for adventurism in looking at the broader demands of reconciliation and transitional justice? By the way, Justice, thank you so much for this judgment.
Thank you very much, and for that, I forgive you for standing me up the other night. Look, the Ogiek judgment is one of those judgments. I mean, I've just been there the other day, 1 or 2 years ago. But that judgment, it's a long judgment. I mean, it dates back to 2016 when the first judgment was, is one of the central judgments that I think we should emulate in dealing with the whole question of ancestral land. And what, for me, coming from South Africa, where there was an attempt to deal with the whole question of Aboriginal title in Alex Ho, judgment of the Constitutional Court. There were touches of colonialism that, those kinds of judgments dealt with. Here, we deal with a situation where you can't talk about a colonial power being responsible for land dispossession. We talk about an ancestral right that is, claimed by people on the basis of their, entitlement to that piece of land as Aborigines. So, will we do it again? Well, the jury's out, but in the mood in which I think, that court is in, we are going to make a lot of, enemies of member states who have been voting with their feet for out of the, of the court in the recent past. And I think it is largely because we have been giving judgments which have not, been favored or favorable to it. In fact, whilst I'm on that, we had a courtesy visit to Dar es Salaam and we met the president. And it was a strange, meeting, because on the one hand, we have a president who says, in addressing us, that, they have been displeased with some of the judgments from our court, which seem to be taking a view against the member states. And she was wondering why. At the same time, she was saying to us, she and her government have approved, funding for the, for the building of a court with all kinds of facilities. They have approved the land, they have approved the building plans and what have you, and she welcomes the fact that she is going to be the host country, for the court. And yet, Tanzania is one of those countries that have left, that have disengaged from the court. But yeah, it's a long way of saying we will do it again.
I will take one more very short question.
And I don't help by making my answers long.
Professor Vila.
I had a one-on-one with you. Okay, it's all right.
Thank you so much, Justice, for this extraordinary talk. And I obviously have more than one question, but I will only ask one because it's been so enriching and fulfilling and provocative. I just want to ask you if you could share some thoughts on vocation. So you said you at some moment you decided to become a lawyer. At some moment you decided to become a judge. At some moment the Minister of Justice approached you and you sort of wondered whether you would take this position in the African Court of Human and People's Rights, and you sort of deliberated about it and you thought, okay, I will take high office. And we have many students that in their lives will be confronted with questions such as this, whether to take office or not, whether to go into one particular area or not, where to do good and have a fulfilling vocation. And I wonder if you could share some thoughts with us on how you do.
Well, there is a cliche that usually goes, follow your heart. I don't know if I've followed my heart, but I know that from the time that I decided to become a lawyer, and that is the time when I was in jail. And what shaped my entire decision was the way in which I felt the Chief Justice of that Pandustan, which tried us, was literally descending into the arena and found us guilty even before he had tried the case. And then I decided, I think I'm going. I mean, for instance, one of the remarks which has become embedded in my memory about that very first day when we appeared before him, he says to the Attorney General who was going to lead the prosecution, he says, Mr. Attorney, I see that only 2 of these 5 accused persons before me have legal representation. I would hope that the other 3, I'm prepared to adjourn these proceedings so that the other 3 can also get, even if it is pro reo, representation. Because judging only from the charges in the charges, I can see that the death sentence is competent. Well, you know, I mean, death sentence is competent means. So from that moment, my mind was made up. I was a school teacher before, but I felt if, you know, the death sentence was not passed, which was not, then what I would do would be to pursue justice through the courts. And yeah, and when I was released, I joined a firm of attorneys, and the senior partner in that firm of attorneys was very committed to representing those offenders who were being charged for political reasons. That's where I met, you know, the vendor, Christine Felt, yeah. So yeah, you follow your heart sometimes. And I did. And I don't regret it. Thank you.
Lastly, Justice, just a tone of appreciation from us at Notre Dame. Ladies and gentlemen, as you could tell from my introductory speech, I have absolute admiration for you, Justice Ntsebeza. Your work has inspired myself as a student of the law to actually go into law. Your work has certainly been inspirational to me as an attorney, and now as an academic as well. The work that you have done in ensuring that South Africa becomes a democracy, we are absolutely indebted to people like you in your generation, because some of us would not be here right now had it not been for your efforts in the service and liberation of our people in South Africa. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for Justice Ntsebeza. We have a very special Notre Dame bag tag with our address, so that should you ever want to come back or ever get lost, we'll always find your way back here. Included in here is also a basketball jersey.
Oh.
Because you and I had a good time on Saturday,
yeah,
watching the basketball. So from us,
and I brought luck because you won.
yes, and the cameras were. So Justice Ntsebeza, on behalf of the Notre Dame scholarly community, we thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is